My name is Leah. I had two brothers. One died in an accident. 2 years later, cancer took my mom. Please endeavor to subscribe to our channel. You will be awesome if you do. Losing my loved ones hurt me deeply, but the pain my dad brought into my life, that pain broke me completely. I was 18 then, and I still remember my mom last whispered words to me. Forgiveness doesn't have boundaries, Leah. How it started. I had placed 2 documents on the polished mahogany table. The first was my acceptance letter to the prestigious Euterpe Conservatory of Musical Arts, outlining my focus on contemporary composition and performance. The second was the final invoice, a non-refundable first-semester commitment fee of $12,000, due in 48 hours. My father, a surgeon whose hands were used to controlling life and death, picked up the conservatory letter. He didn't tear it. His cruelty was far more refined. He simply held the paper between 2 fingers as if it were contaminated waste. "You are a female child," he stated, his voice flat, emotionless, delivered like a diagnosis. "You should do what I ask you to do. You have no choice." The words struck me with paralyzing injustice. It wasn't about the money. He could fund a dozen conservatories without noticing the withdrawal. It was about control, hierarchy, and his rigid patriarchal vision. He wanted me in the sterile, high-pressure world of neurosurgery, a world of logic and quantifiable outcomes, not the messy, intangible realm of music. He saw music as a recreational footnote, not a career, but more dangerously, he saw my dreams as irrelevant because of my gender. "My talent is in music," I countered, my voice shaking only slightly. This was the moment of the great divide, the point of no return. "I have been practicing and composing since I was 10. I have a gift and I intend to use it. I will not study surgery just to be your resident, silent partner." He put the letter down and leaned forward, his eyes cold and distant, devoid of the warmth I had last seen when my mother was alive. "Then you do not understand priority, Leah." I stated my wish. "I just wanted to help you. You do not take priority, especially since you are a female child pursuing a financial fantasy. My action is withdrawal. The consequence is rejection and absolute abandonment. If you walk out that door tonight, you will never receive a dime. Do you understand the definition of abandonment?" The phrase, rejection and abandonment, was the catalyst. It was the final total confirmation that the love I sought was merely conditional on my compliance. I had already lost my mother and brother. The dread of losing my future to his control was worse than the dread of destitution. My father had presented an equation with only one correct answer, but my composer's mind saw an opportunity to introduce a new, disruptive variable: self-reliance. My choice was immediate and final. I stood up, grabbing my worn instrument case, my keyboard controller and sheet music, my only real possessions. I left behind my clothes, my expensive textbooks, and the remnants of my childhood. Those were his assets. My music was mine. "I understand," I said, looking him straight in the eye, feeling the surge of anger fuel my resolve. "My choice is freedom. And therefore the consequence is that I will pay that $12,000 deposit myself. Do not call me when I succeed." I walked out the front door, closing it with a quiet click that felt more definitive than any slam. I was now 18, a gifted musician, and completely alone in the world with $63 in my wallet. The ticking clock began. 48 hours to find $12,000, or my spot at Euterpe, my one beacon of hope, would vanish. I knew that sum was impossible to earn in 2 days through conventional means. My immediate focus, however, had to be survivability. I took the bus downtown and found the cheapest, shadiest hostel room available for $35 for the first night. The remaining $28 was converted into instant noodles, bus fare, and a single strong cup of coffee. The first action was to secure the long-term, low-cost base of operations. I secured a tiny, windowless studio apartment the next morning, paying the first month's rent of $500 with a high-interest credit card I had forgotten I owned, a debt that immediately filled me with acute anxiety. I needed 2 jobs, and I needed them immediately. I landed a job waiting tables at a high-volume diner near the university campus, working the brutal 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. shift. The tips were decent, but the hours consumed the morning, the peak time for creative work. Therefore, I had to find a secondary job that allowed for flexibility. My musical gift, ironically, became my second job. I began tutoring local high school students in composition and piano theory, taking the 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. slots. The money trickled in slowly but consistently. The grind was relentless. My days were a blur of serving bad coffee, calculating music intervals, and collapsing onto a thin mattress. The narrative engine was now driven by scarcity. I had the money for rent, but the constant exhaustion stole the energy needed for my own music. I had secured my position at Euterpe with a small $500 emergency loan from a distant, sympathetic aunt. I told her it was for books, pushing the $12,000 deposit back to the start of the semester, but the need to pay for tuition and survival was a massive, looming presence. My choice to pursue music required an unwavering commitment to practice. I needed at least 3 hours a day to keep my skill sharp enough to enter the competitive field. But the 2 jobs left me with only an hour late at night, often performed on a cheap digital keyboard with headphones, the melodies thin and muffled. I was paying the price of self-sponsorship with the quality of my art, and that filled me with a deep, private dread. The climax of this initial struggle was the inevitable physical breakdown. 4 months into this dual life, fueled by caffeine and pure defiance, I was a functional system running at capacity. On one cold, wet morning, rushing between the diner and the university to teach a theory session, the worn tires of a delivery truck lost grip on the slick road. The collision was instant and total. The physical pain was sharp, intense, and demanding. The consequence was a broken leg and a concussion which instantly shut down both my income streams. I was financially paralyzed. Lying in the sterile silence of the hospital bed, the emotional fallout was the most crushing blow. My father, the surgeon, never visited. He never sent a card. His action of rejection was confirmed, total and final. This profound, fresh wave of abandonment sent me into a deep, dark depression. My instrument case remained untouched in my tiny apartment. The dream, once a beacon, now felt like a cruel joke. I nearly stopped school altogether, seeing no way out of the accumulating medical debt and the impossibility of catching up on my classes. But that's when I remembered my mother's voice, echoing from the past. The true test of my choice was not the strength of my father's rejection, but the tenacity of my own will to continue. I had to find a new action to overcome this physical and psychological roadblock, or the consequence would be complete surrender. The plaster cast felt less like a bandage and more like a tomb. It stretched from my thigh to my ankle, heavy and chalky white, pinning me to the thin hospital mattress for 6 weeks. This enforced stillness was the absolute antithesis of my life, which had been defined by constant, frantic motion between 2 jobs and a demanding school schedule. The only movement now was the drip of the 4 and the slow, relentless spin of my mind, caught in a cycle of dread. The accident hadn't just broken bone. It had shattered my momentum, and the resulting financial paralysis was terrifying. The insurance claim, hampered by my lack of a primary guarantor, was in bureaucratic quicksand. The bills for the surgery piled up like a white, inescapable wall on the nightstand. I was now not just fighting for my future tuition, but for my right to simply exist without crippling medical debt. This was the final, devastating consequence of my father's abandonment. Even an emergency was met with cold, surgical indifference. The fact that the city's top trauma surgeon, my father, never once checked the file, never sent a specialist, or even called the general ward, was a rejection so absolute it broke my spirit more effectively than the truck had broken my leg. I sank into a depression so profound it felt physical. I saw no way out. The thought of returning to the diner with a limp or trying to teach advanced theory while financially ruined made Euterpe feel impossible. I nearly followed through on the thought of dropping out, ready to surrender to the simple low-wage life that requires no dreams, no choice. My saving grace arrived on a rainy Tuesday, wheeling in a thermos of strong sweet tea. It was Maya, a fellow composition student from Euterpe, a fiery violinist who saw the world in rhythmic possibilities. She didn't offer pity, she offered a challenge. "You've been MIA for 6 weeks, Leah. This is unacceptable," Maya declared, her words sharp and bracing. "You are a composer. Composers do not die in hospital beds. They write the requiem and then they stand up and perform it." She pulled a glossy flyer from her bag and slapped it gently onto my chest. It was the entry form for the Opus Magna Collegiate Showcase. The event wasn't just a university recital. It was the most important local competition of the year. The grand prize was a $10,000 cash stipend, enough to wipe out my immediate medical debt and cover a significant portion of my tuition. But the stakes were impossibly high. The competition was nationally televised on a local arts channel, and the entire event was judged by a single person, Dr. Elias Vance. Dr. Vance was a living legend, the composer who defined the modern cinematic score, and he was notoriously merciless, known for dismantling a student's work with clinical precision. The thought of facing his judgment, combined with the pressure of live television and my current fragile state, filled me with paralyzing anxiety. "I can't, Maya," I whispered, turning my face away. "I'm physically immobilized. I'm a wreck. I can't even sit at my keyboard for more than 20 minutes. I have nothing left to give." Maya leaned closer, her eyes serious. "You have your mother's voice, Leah. The one that said forgiveness doesn't have boundaries. That boundary is what your father built around your life. Your music is the bulldozer. You are drowning in his choice to abandon you. You need to make a new choice. One that is so loud, so undeniable, that it defines your identity, not his rejection." Her words hit me like a physical shock. My mother's phrase wasn't just about pity. It was about the endless capacity of the self to choose grace, even when subjected to cruelty. My action could not be surrender. It had to be a reclamation of self. Therefore I had to compete. The $10,000 was the essential key, but the greater victory would be proving my value in the one domain my father rejected. The next 3 weeks were a blur of grueling physical therapy and frantic composition. I used my physical pain, the constant grinding ache in my leg, as the foundation for my piece. I titled it Fracture and Fidelity. The composition was a sonic narrative of my trauma. It began with the quiet, predatory silence of the dining room, represented by a single dissonant piano chord held for too long. This quickly gave way to a manic percussive passage played with jarring, unpredictable rhythms, symbolizing the financial scramble and the exhaustion of the two jobs. The climax of the first movement was a brutal arrhythmic crash, a violent cluster of notes played on the lowest register, the accident. The second movement began with the deep, haunting resonance of a single cello, played softly, almost like a human voice. This was my mother's voice, the fidelity of her unconditional love that provided the counterpoint to the fracture of my family. I designed the piece to be performed by just me on the piano and Maya on the cello, emphasizing the theme of isolated support. My performance technique was severely limited by my cast. I couldn't use the sustain pedal effectively, and the pain made my concentration waver. But this limitation forced a creative choice. I wrote the piece to utilize staccato, fragmented passages and sudden, unexpected rests, turning my physical constraint into a unique stylistic signature. The night of the Opus Magna arrived. The grand auditorium at Euterpe was packed, the stage bathed in unforgiving white light. A camera dolly tracked slowly along the front, broadcasting the event live. My entire body hummed with anxiety. I was wheeled onto the stage in a sleek black wheelchair, my cast hidden beneath a long, dark gown. Dr. Elias Vance sat at a small table in the center orchestra pit, his face expressionless, his legendary caustic reputation preceding him. The sight of him, a man whose judgment could solidify or destroy a career in a single sentence, was almost enough to make me flee. Maya took her place and I placed my fingers on the cold keys. I didn't look at the audience or the camera. I looked at the music. The action was pure defiance. I played the opening silence, then the chord. It vibrated in the hall, heavy and wrong. I launched into the frantic passage, my hands blurring across the keys, the energy of months of repressed anger pouring into the percussive attack. The section dedicated to the accident was jarring. The music physically hurt to listen to. Therefore I was honest. As I transitioned to the second movement, the chaos subsided. Maya's cello entered, rich and full, a low, comforting hum that felt like a lifeline. I played the melody of my mother's theme. Simple, profound, built on a foundation of absolute, unwavering major chords. It was the sound of forgiveness, of self-determination, and the triumph of the soul over circumstances. The audience was silent, completely drawn into the intimacy of the trauma and the slow, gorgeous climb out of the darkness. When the final note faded, a single resolved C major chord, the silence was deafening. Then a slow building wave of applause. I looked at Dr. Vance. His face was no longer cold. He was rising to his feet, a rare, almost mythical sight. The consequence was instant. Dr. Vance himself walked onto the stage and placed the heavy, engraved gold medal around my neck, securing my victory. "Miss Leah," he announced into the microphone, his voice cutting through the applause. "You didn't play a piece of music. You gave us a mandatory lesson in artistic survival. The work is structurally flawed, your use of the sustain pedal was terrible, but the emotional fidelity is the most honest score I have heard in a decade. Go and heal. Euterpe needs you." The $10,000 prize money was secured. The crushing medical debt was wiped clean. The rejection was replaced by a profound public validation. The next day, the emails started flooding in: requests for performance licenses, inquiries from music management firms, and a call from a massive advertising agency that needed a raw, emotional score for a new campaign. The first callback came from the largest, most powerful firm of all, the one that defined the market. My new life had begun not through compliance but through sheer, unyielding choice. The contract lay on the table of the Apex Global Executive Lounge, a fortress of glass and steel that overlooked the entire city, a literal view of the world Leah had just conquered. My eyes were drawn not to the six-figure fee, an amount that instantly guaranteed tuition, wiped out the rest of my loan, and provided financial scaffolding for years, but to the restrictive clauses. My recent win, fracture and fidelity, was a composition of profound, painful intimacy. Apex wanted the opposite: a three-note, instantly recognizable theme for their new massive global marketing campaign, something dubbed Ascend. It needed to be cheerful, universal, and utterly devoid of trauma. My inner composer, the one who lived for the complicated resonance of a minor chord, felt a sickening lurch. This was the ultimate choice: trade high art for high visibility. I was still balancing on the financial knife edge left by the accident, and the lingering anxiety of potential debt was a powerful fuel. I had to choose survivability first. My action was pragmatic: take the money, gain the platform, and earn the right to make the art I truly loved later. Therefore I signed the contract. The brief for Ascend was deceptively simple: a theme that evoked immediate, optimistic forward momentum. I spent a grueling week in the studio, dismantling my complex compositional habits, forcing simplicity. The result was 3 seconds of pure auditory dopamine, a bright, layered synth theme that sounded like the sun breaking over a mountain ridge. It was catchy, infectious, and, to my initial shame, genius. The consequence was instant global saturation. Apex Global launched the campaign across 180 countries simultaneously. The Ascend theme wasn't just background noise. It became the sound of the new decade. It was the music played when the commercial showed a sleek vehicle accelerating, a CEO shaking hands, or a runner crossing a finish line. It was on every phone, every radio, and crucially, every single television screen. I became instantly and massively popular. I was no longer Leah, the struggling student composer. I was the prodigy behind Ascend. This initial viral success became the narrative engine driving the next 10 years. I didn't finish Euterpe, I graduated early. My music was no longer confined to the practice room. It was requested for increasingly high-stakes arenas. My subsequent actions built my empire on the foundation of that first commercial choice. First, I leveraged the visibility into cinematic work. I scored an action film that demanded intense, percussive energy, allowing me to channel some of the repressed anger and frantic rhythm from my fracture piece into a professionally acceptable format. But the commercial success demanded more personal appearances, more interviews, and more being on camera. My talent was in composing music, but my fame came from being a recognizable figure on the screen. My father, the man who saw the world in sterile surgery suites, was now having his environment invaded by the very thing he had rejected. One of the most defining moments of my ascent was securing the contract to compose the official theme for the Global Games, the largest televised sporting event in the world. This was the pinnacle of mass-market music. The composition had to be powerful, inspirational, and televised to billions. This commission was not just a job, it was a global televised victory lap. The magnitude of it filled me with awe and a sharp sense of satisfaction. I remembered his exact words: "You do not take priority, especially since you are a female child." Every time I accepted a massive public contract, the action felt like I was screaming my priority across the airwaves. The consequence was that my financial security became fortress-like. I bought an apartment with a soundproof studio that was larger than the entire house I grew up in. I hired a team, managed my brand, and built my legacy not despite his rejection, but directly because of the self-reliance it demanded. The decade passed in a blur of red carpets, international travel, and constant deadlines. Every album, every score, every award was a brick in the wall of my self-made life. I never initiated contact. The silence from my father was the expected heavy tax of my freedom. I assumed he watched, silent, seething, his own environment constantly being corrupted by the sound of my success. Then came the call. It was 10 years after the night I walked out with. I was in my studio, finalizing the arrangement for a new symphony commissioned by the city. A return to pure high art expression, finally financed by the commerce I had mastered. My phone vibrated with an unfamiliar number. I answered, expecting my manager. The voice on the other end was rough, hesitant, and entirely recognizable. Leah. The sound of my name from his mouth after 10 years of absolute void was physically jarring. I felt the familiar cold knot of anger tighten in my chest, mixed with the shock of having my carefully constructed emotional shield breached. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice calm, professional, and utterly disconnected. "It's your father. How are you doing?" The sheer banality of the question, "How are you doing?" after a decade of total abandonment, was an insult. It was the ultimate minimization of my struggle, my pain, and my success. It wasn't an apology. It was a hesitant probe. But the emotional engine of the narrative needed to shift. I had built my career on anger and defiance. Now the consequence of my success required a different choice. I didn't answer the question. "Dad," I pressed him. "Why are you calling, Father?" A long, labored silence followed. The famous surgeon, the man of absolute control, was struggling for words. I saw you on the television, Leah. You performed the theme at the grand opening of the new arts center. It was a magnificent performance. You achieved your goal." He sounded tired, frail, completely unlike the iron-willed man who had shattered my drone and my dreams years ago. The realization hit me. My action was complete. I had forced the world, and him, to acknowledge my priority. My success was no longer a personal achievement. It was an unavoidable, televised fact. The call ended shortly thereafter with an awkward promise of a future meeting that neither of us believed. Therefore my choice was clear. My success was the only repayment I would ever need. The narrative shifts again from the peak of professional success to the final emotional confrontation. The prompt stated that my father is now on his sickbed, requiring my intervention. The great choice of the final 2 chapters revolves around my mother's core philosophy. Forgiveness doesn't have boundaries. I have achieved everything and paid him back with success. Now he is on the sickbed. My final, most defining action must be the flight for his neurosurgery.